welcome back to Earth Station Trek, a show where we trek from the early days on NBC to the future on Paramount Plus and everywhere in between. I'm Charles Kelso, and it's my privilege to introduce the Earth Station Trek crew: Keith Johnson,
The future's got to be better than this.
Alan Seiler,
But what if it isn't?
and Monica Dashel.
Hi.
And we're back.
Hey,
What's up, everybody?
And we're going to be talking tonight about Star Trek and Gene's vision, which has come up several times on the show before, but a little bit more of a deep dive tonight. But first, Alan, do we have any news this week?
There are just some weeks where nothing really interesting happens, and there's just nothing to report. But this is not one of those weeks because we got the first official announcement that Strange New Worlds Season 4 has begun production.
All right.
That is awesome. We don't even have an air date yet for Season 3, but they've already started work on Season 4, which is very exciting because that means that we at least have 2 seasons coming up. I mean, we knew that because we knew that it had already been renewed for a 4th season, but they started shooting, and it's great news.
Right.
The other thing, and this is also Strange New Worlds related, is that this afternoon there was a whole batch of new character portraits released, and these are gorgeous shots. And I'm sorry I did not have the opportunity to put together a graphic to show on screen, but every character is shown like shoulder up. Everybody has new hair. Pike doesn't really have new hair, it's just taller. But and everybody is sort of like this very stark lighting with some kind of like spacey projection on their face.
Right.
And I tell you, these are gorgeous portraits. I love them.
Yeah. They usually have really good promo photos of the cast for the seasons, but yeah, I think this one is the best one they've done yet. They're just great looking photos.
Yep. So everything is ramping up for Strange New Worlds. So that's exciting. Hopefully it won't be too much longer before we find out when Season 3 will be starting.
Yeah, usually the promotional material is shortly before we get official announcements. And
Exactly.
I'm glad that they've started shooting Season 4 before the new Skydance people take over.
Right.
Like we've said before, it's easier to keep working on it if you're already in it, if you're already shooting.
Yep, exactly. So that's basically it for the news this week, but that's some really exciting news.
Yeah. All right, Keith, do we have some This Week in Trek this week?
hey, one real quick thing about news that I can't forget. I know we published it, but did we talk about William Shatner saying somebody asked him to come back to Star Trek? Did we talk about?
I don't know. We talked about it on Facebook, but I don't think we talked about it on the show. And yeah, you're talking about an interview he gave where he mentioned that someone involved with a new Star Trek had talks with him about, or wanted to talk to him about coming back, but was pretty vague.
Yeah, he just said, this is what he said. It was funny. Some writer at Paramount who says he's attached to Star Trek said, hey, I want you to come back to Star Trek.
Nah. I mean, Bill says all kinds of shit. So,
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
I
would love for them to get him involved in some capacity. I mean, while he's still with us, because there's a finite number of years left for that.
Indeed.
I do too. Right. I've always found it interesting. People have always said that it would be so difficult to bring Kirk back because of how he died on that stupid planet. And to me, it never made it was like the very nature of that show would allow him to be brought back. I mean, the whole thing was that crazy nexus. So all you can simply say was the nexus energy bathed his body, and it took a little bit, and then he got better. And you're kind of done.
Or just do like they did with Worf in Star Trek Insurrection. And we're like, Worf, what are you doing here? And then they just cut away real quick before he could explain.
That's great. Yeah. I love those.
Mr. Worf, we don't have time for explanations right now.
Yeah. Just don't think about it. Yeah, I've got a couple of things in Star Trek history this week. This is just a personal favorite, so I bring it up because it makes me cry every time I watch it. On the 2nd of March, way back in 1967, Leonard Nimoy starred with Charles Bronson's wife, Jill Ireland, in This Side of Paradise, which is a famous episode with the spores, where this is such a classic Star Trek episode. One, you have the whole thing with the spores that made people happy, and it has actually generated generations of debate about, we're going to talk about Gene's vision. There are so many people who say that was against Gene's vision because basically you got a bunch of people who get high on drugs and are useless. And there are others who honestly, sincerely say, no, if they want to get high on drugs, as it were, the spores, and chill out, that's their right. But look at the end of the show. Kirk himself basically said humans weren't meant to chill out. We got to have battles and so forth.
Right.
I love the themes clashing there. Another reason this is an interesting episode. This is one of what became quite a decent handful of episodes that was originally written for Sulu, and attended to Sulu, and they thought, hey, better idea than Sulu, who has the girlfriend. Let's give it to Mr. Spock. And then that started happening quite a few times for Sulu, unfortunately. One, because George had gone off to do, the Green Berets with John Wayne. And it took way longer than he thought. They started giving several roles that were meant for Sulu. They went to Chekhov. Right. And he always regretted doing that. But that was also, I think this is a much better show with Spock, of course.
Yeah, I would love to have gotten more Sulu, and I hate that he lost a really good part. But this is a Spock episode. Right. They're absolutely right.
Totally.
Yeah. Then another one. Let's see what this is for. Oh, this I found very interesting. March 4th, 1967, just 2 days after This Side of Paradise aired, was the first official TV Guide cover dedicated to the ongoing series Star Trek. Has a picture of William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy on the cover, and of course, the first of many. Also a good one. Something else I found, I completely didn't know this one. All the way back to 1956, the 6th of March, there was a TV show. I've seen some episodes. It was called the Chevron Theater Anthology. And for those old enough to remember, that used to be like Alcoa Presents, and there used to be all this crazy stuff. Well, on March the 6th, 1956, an episode aired called The Secret Weapon of 117, and it starred none other than Ricardo Montalban, and the show was written by Gene Roddenberry, and it's his first credited science fiction story.
Awesome.
Cool. I had no idea they even worked together that far back.
I have something to add real quick that I was thinking I was correct in, but This Side of Paradise features in one of my chapters in our book.
It does.
Really? How's that?
You will see.
Oh, okay.
And what book is that, Veronica?
It's our Earth Station Trek Guide to Star Trek.
Is it this one right here?
Yeah.
I love it.
Look at that.
It just crawls across the screen.
Real book.
Yeah.
Ooh. We'll talk a little more about that later.
Awesome.
Also interesting. Exactly 10 years later to the day, from 1956, we jumped to 1966. And exactly 2 years after Gene Roddenberry wrote his first draft of this hoped-for series called Star Trek, March 6, 1966, Paramount, or Desilu, dedicated official sound stages to 2 shows to go into full production. One was Star Trek, and can you guess what the other one was at Desilu at the time? Very popular show.
Mission Impossible?
You got it.
That would have been my guess too.
Yeah.
100%.
Isn't that wild? Both shows under Desilu, both shows under the company of Lucy Ardez and Lucille Ball. And of course, both classic episodes. And we got one more. I thought this is also pretty interesting. On the 8th of March, 1966, and what a year that was for Gene. That's when Gene Roddenberry first screened his cut of Where No Man Has Gone Before, for who would become his core of Star Trek writers, including Richard Matheson. Of course, we know what happened with that episode, blah, blah, blah. The network didn't love it, but they gave it a second pilot, which almost never happens. But one of the things I read about was when they saw it, Richard Matheson, of course, famous writer and so forth. One of the things, Isaac Asimov was involved. They literally said, Gene, is this thing possibly going to make it on television? Because it just looked too different from anything they'd ever seen on television on that level.
Yeah.
Well, that's this weekend, Star Trek history.
Awesome. Well, this week, speaking of Gene, we're going to be talking a bit about Gene's vision. And Keith, you suggested this topic. So did you want to, I'm sorry, Alan, did you have some comments you wanted to grab?
Yeah. Comments about our intro. Yes.
Go right ahead.
There are always comments about our intro. Elaine says she's looking forward to Strange New Worlds and she loves the new promo headshots that they released. Space Daddy is looking good.
Indeed.
She also says that she really liked This Side of Paradise.
Yes.
Matt says This Side of Paradise introduced Kirk's Samsonite suitcase.
Yeah, it's got the it's great. It's got the latches.
There's
on
a
it.
detail you don't think of too often.
Yeah.
And about the book, Matt says, "Oh crap, it exists." And Elaine says, it's a real book. Looks great. Just
Yes, it
wait till
does.
you see it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for comments. Now
one
we
day
can
this
proceed.
book will get left on a planet and they'll base their society around it.
Yes.
Oh, that'd be great.
All right, Keith, you want to cue up our discussion about Gene's vision?
Yeah. Actually, I wrote one of my essays in our upcoming book is about this, and we've talked about this so much with most recently Section 31. And the thing you get outside of stuff like Section 31 and Discovery, what you always hear is people say, this is good, but is it Star Trek? And they always say, does it adhere to Gene's vision? I mentioned this before, but I was listening to another podcast where the two guys were discussing City on the Edge of Forever. Loved it, acknowledged it's arguably the single best episode of the original series. Loved it, talked about how great it was. And then one guy goes, but is it Star Trek? And they both reluctantly agreed it's not real Star Trek, quote unquote. Why? Because it didn't have an overt moral message or meaning. And it didn't teach us things like racism is wrong and evil is wrong. As a matter of fact, they even said it's almost an anti-Gene message because it actually said peace is wrong sometimes at the wrong time.
Right.
And you hear that so much with shows that we all love, like Deep Space Nine. Sisko, the actions he took in the Pale Moonlight, and I forget the other episode where he goes nuts and what's his name keeps calling him Jover, and he starts destroying atmospheres or something he wouldn't do. Slight spoilers, all Archer in Enterprise almost kills somebody, commits an act of piracy, and every time that happens, people say this is not Gene's vision. These people are better than this. And then you look at some of the movies. Gene himself hated Star Trek. Is it 6, The Undiscovered Country?
He hated any of them that he wasn't getting paid for.
That's true.
That was Gene's vision.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. But he said it was horrible because they were showing Federation high-ranking officers who were part of a conspiracy. And Gene honestly felt at some point in time, we would just get better. And it's why TNG had no conflict among the crew. I personally feel, and we'll talk about, I personally feel that when Gene got to TNG and later, I think he was too, I'm not going to say optimistic, but unrealistic. But so much you hear nowadays about these new shows and movies and stuff is it Gene's vision?
So, from my limited experience with Gene's vision, I think it's wrong and it's not going to happen. I don't think all of the entirety of humanity is going to be good and righteous, and I think we could potentially overall get to a point where it's significantly flipped from where it is now, where there's a lot of really bad people and a couple of pretty good people. But I think there's always going to be those couple of people that just want power for power, and there's not going to be, and unless we like do genocide and just start breeding them out.
Eugenics wars.
Wow.
There we go. That's the eugenics wars right
Charles, did you know your wife can start the eugenics war?
Well, I'm on her side.
Do you want the eugenics war? This is how we get the eugenics war. Here's the thing. Gene's vision is like the Bible. The Bible is written down. You can read it. There are words on a page, and yet every person has a different interpretation of what those words mean. And Gene had a vision for Star Trek, but it is not written down. It is not something that you can refer to and read, and there's nothing really terribly concrete about it. So it is open to even more interpretation, and everybody who says this doesn't live up to Gene's vision might have something completely different in their own mind about what Gene's vision is.
Yeah, and it changed over the years.
Of course.
I mean, in the 70s, when you have sort of the gurufication of Gene, where, I mean, he was struggling to get television projects on the air, but a big source of his income was traveling around to college campuses and conventions and giving speeches to people about himself, about his vision of the future and what Star Trek really means. And really, it's, you're all right and the rest of the world is wrong. and thank you for paying to come see me today. But I mean, you look back at the original Star Trek, and in the original Star Trek Bible, which is it's reprinted in Gene and Stephen Whitfield's book, and it starts off that the setting could be 1999 or it could be 2999, but then he specifies it's far enough in the future for space travel to be fully established, but close enough to our time that people are still people. And I'm sort of paraphrasing that there. But the idea was that human beings are still human beings. We're just in space now. And that was a big theme in the original series, is that I'm a killer, but I'm not going to kill today. Like, we are making the effort to get better, and we're making choices to get better. Whereas by the next generation, it had become more of a perfected humanity, where you have things like they're having debates about does a child grieve when their parents die, and things like that just sort of take you out of it. But I really prefer the original series version of it, which you get a lot more, in the films and also in Deep Space Nine, where people still feel like people. And there's people of every stripe out there. But then people having to make difficult choices to do what they believe in. And that's some sort of a recurring theme in the newer Star Trek, is that the organizations that we have come to respect and rely on are betraying us and failing us. And it's up to the individuals to step up. And I think that's really more of a reflection of our time and where we are politically. But I think that's very much in line with what Star Trek is.
Mm-hmm.
Right. The way I always look at it is that Gene's vision really is more about, it's not about us evolving until we're perfect. It's not about us becoming ideal humans. I think that what it is, and I've said this once before on our show, it's the way that we respond to different circumstances. And, it's just like we were saying, I'm a killer, but I'm not going to kill today. And, you're going to have war. You're going to have disagreement. You're going to have conflict. It's how we respond to those things. And I think the more that we respond in a positive way to those things, and the more that we stand up for ideals and beliefs that we hold to be right, I think that that's the progress. And I think the whole thing is about taking steps. And this really goes back to season 4 of Enterprise, where you kind of see human society really taking steps toward becoming what Gene thought we would be, where it starts out with, we've just been attacked by these aliens that we don't know anything about. And the response is to suddenly we're anti-alien. We are separationists, but there are steps throughout that season that bring us more in line and leading up to the end of that season, where the Federation is formed. And I think that the whole point of this thing is the journey.
Yeah, I think that's well said.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, Matt Sweatman had a good comment there.
Let me get, he says that he thinks Gene's vision evolved between the original series and the motion picture.
And I agree.
But he also says, I think Trek's most successful when it's inspired and mindful of Gene's vision, but does not tie its hands too much by taking a strict interpretation of his vision. Agreed.
Yeah. And really, I think it's our heroes need to be noble in doing what's right. I don't think that everyone else in the galaxy needs to be doing that, because then you get sort of tepid stories. But even you're talking about Strange New World, not Strange New Worlds, but Section 31, which is, we were all disappointed by, right? But I said this in our episode about it, but I think there are ways where you could do a Section 31 story. But I think the key would be our heroes need to be in opposition to Section 31. It's kind of like if you ever saw Alias. Alias was about a woman who was an agent for an organization, but then she finds out that the organization she's working for is evil. And so she's working as a double agent for the CIA. So she's going on missions for this evil organization while trying to undermine them and work for the CIA. Something like that for Section 31, I think, could work. But I think it's the thing that really bothered me about Section 31 was that the heroes weren't particularly heroic, even though they're doing something to save the day at the end. But I don't really care for the idea of Section 31 generally, but especially making Section 31 the heroes of the story, I just really don't care for.
Right.
That's a very interesting point. I think there's several things y'all said that I found very interesting. Charles, you mentioned several times about Gene Roddenberry's, frankly, his ego. And, there were some things that there's some, his sexual proclivities and feelings cut into his shows. No doubt, there's just truth about that. But yeah, his he was, I think, if he would be able to call it anything, I guess he is what you would call a secular humanist. He didn't overtly hate religion. But like Alan was saying about the Bible, you can interpret it you can interpret it different ways. And I think that's a whole other conversation. I think there's some very important things when you talk about religions and theologies. There are people who just don't ascribe to them. There are people who use them loosely. They're spiritual. There are people who are completely agnostic, and that's fine. And then there are some people who completely hate religions and theologies. They destroy them. They just think they shouldn't exist in any shape, form, or fashion. And to what Alan was saying, I don't think Gene was like that. He wasn't a man of the Bible, probably was raised in the church, especially being a Texan, but he had his views on, like you said, humans weren't perfect, but they were going to get better. And I do think that when you talk about Enterprise, I think that's a very good example. I know, Charles, it's not your favorite show, but I think it's very good, Alan's talking about, because there's a whole thing at basically a bar in San Francisco where Phlox gets attacked by a bunch of racist humans because they are literally like Earth for humans or Terra for Terrans and stuff like that.
Yep, make Earth great again.
What's that? Again?
Said make Earth great again.
Yes. No. Well, look, real life. That's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah. And
Mega.
Yeah. And it was so weird because Archer and his crew had been out there and they had been working with Phlox. They'd been working with T'Pol, and they had seen people that weren't humans. And they also knew, real life, very realistic. They knew what other people had been doing for humans, and humans were kind of like, we don't need you. We did this without you. And It's kind of like, well, you know what? The damn Vulcans came to save you because you were just running around with radiation poisoning. Yes, we invented warp drive. And I think that part of Enterprise was very good, as Alan said, because and even the way that Scott Bakula and the people played it, they acted differently than the people in the bar. They had that look of someone who's seen the world. There's a look that people have, and you saw that with them. And I thought it was a really good lesson about what Gene was trying to say. And one reason, I'm glad Alan brought that up, and I've said this many times, it sounds very weird, I have always loved Star Trek best when Star Trek is frank with prejudices and racism and homophobia and all that stuff, because the point is not that we're perfect. The point is that we acknowledge it and we get past it if we can. And so that's why I did love that aspect of Enterprise. And Charles, you said something very interesting. I felt the same way today. I was thinking about it. In some ways, I still like the OS better than many of the later shows because they were allowed to be prejudice. Kirk was allowed to say, I met the Gorn and I hate him because he's a reptile. And I got to fight to remember he's a starship captain. I love stuff like that. Zephyr Cochrane, he's been hanging out with the companion for decades. Then he's like, ooh, you mean that nasty energy thing loves me? This is perverted. What kind of guys are you from the future? And then he loves her. Then Charles, you point out it was the 60s, so she had to get back into a pretty woman's body.
Yeah.
But I
if
love
that energy thing turned into
Eleanor
Eleanor Donahue, I would love it too.
But I love the fact they were being honest about it. Now, that part of it, I think, is kind of what Gene's vision was. But I do think when he got to say TNG and like what he had with the movies, he was a little bit more wanted humans to be a little too perfect, which is, again, why we didn't have so much conflict.
Yes, but let's remember that in the original series pilot, it was a lot different than it was when you go to series, because the network wanted more shoot 'em up. They wanted more action. They wanted more conflict. And I think that once you get to Next Generation, when the show is being produced direct to syndication and Gene has more control over what he wants the show to be and be able to make it actually to screen, I think that that's when you really start to see, more of what's in his mind, I think, because, the original series was shaped, at least to some degree, by network demands.
Sure.
You had studio demands in Next Gen because of they're the ones producing it, but you never really got that sense of network demand because it's not on the network.
Right.
And it was kind of like this liberating thing for Gene and for Star Trek.
Right. And Keith, you make a good point about, they would have prejudices on the original series.
Right.
But they would confront them. Like you
Yes.
Styles had prejudices against
Yes.
Romulans or Vulcans by
Mhm.
extension. That was
Mhm.
challenged. Kirk had prejudice against the Gorn. That was challenged by the end. But then
Yeah.
there are cases on Next Generation where you have, I mean, famously, everyone was pretty racist against the Ferengi, and it goes unchallenged. Basically, on the
Yeah.
entirety of Next Gen. I mean, you have scenes like where there's Ferengi coming on the ship, and Riker's like, "Well, just don't put them near my quarters," on the bridge out loud. I mean, if you
Right.
if you substituted, if you said that now, like in your workplace about any group of people,
Yeah.
I mean, that'd be an HR violation, right
Yeah.
off the bat, right? But you never have really Riker confronting that throughout the run of Next Gen. Obviously, we got more of the Ferengi in Deep Space Nine, but
Mhm.
it's interesting that in some ways, the original series was sort of ahead of what they were doing on Next Gen, even though I think Next Gen largely was, obviously 20 years later and further along than the original series was.
That is such a great point. And that also makes me think of another first season episode, Home Soil, where they confront, the bags of mostly water, those aliens. And I think it was that one. And at the end, there's been a misunderstanding and they, talk it out and stuff. And Troy says, I think she says beautiful. You are beautiful to us. All life is beautiful. Unless you're a Ferengi.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. It's one of those blind spots that I wish they would have addressed on the show.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and I find it I think it's very interesting because who did kind of confront that a little bit was Deep Space Nine. Well, kind of, at least Sisko did. And I always found it was, I don't know if it's intentional or not, maybe it was, but I always found it very interesting that when Nog and Jake were first becoming friends and they were hanging out, Sisko basically tells Jake, you can't hang out with him. And it was pretty much, you can't trust those people. And of course,
absolutely,
you can't not see the irony of a black man saying you can't trust those people. I mean, you just can't not see it.
100%.
Yeah,
Yes.
but it works.
Yeah. And I love that they carried it through on Deep Space Nine to the point where, I mean, Nog is a good Starfleet officer in part because he was Grace Ferengi. And I love that it's not despite that he was a Ferengi, but it's things like, he can do a manifest in a cargo bay like nobody else can, right? Like if O'Brien needs a part, he's got the skills to make the negotiations to get that part and track it down, right? There's a lot of things that are really just directly because of his Ferengi upbringing that make him a better Starfleet officer. And I love that pays off on the show.
Yeah.
Let me get this comment from Matt, because this is interesting. He says sometimes there was a uniformity, almost a push to conformity in the Federation's morality. This in and of itself can be a threat to individual liberty.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's interesting. That's a flip side of what we're talking about.
Yeah,
I think
that's a deep thought.
I think in part that's because on Star Trek, the greatest job anyone could ever have is being a Starfleet officer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there is a certain amount of conformity that comes in with joining the organization.
Yes, that's true.
It's sort of taken as read that like Starfleet officer is like the top thing that you could ever be.
That's right.
Right.
And that we have that opportunity with Tawny Newsom's new show coming up to see other things besides life in Starfleet. We are going to be able to see average Joes, and see what life is like in the Star Trek universe when you're not an enlisted officer.
Right. We got a little bit of that in the first season of Picard, but they abandoned that very quickly.
Yes.
All right. Well, do we want to take a quick break for a promo or two? And then when we come back,
Sure.
we'll get right back into Gene's vision.
Why don't we? Here we go.
Welcome to Stellar Fest, where we're celebrating the worlds you love, from Star Wars to Star Trek, Doctor Who, and beyond. Dive into an immersive weekend of cosplay, panels covering your favorite sci-fi fandoms, RPGs, themed activities, and out-of-this-world merchandise. Don't miss your chance to connect with fellow fans and celebrate the universe's greatest sagas. Get your tickets now at stellarfest.org.
your background music's driving Veronica wild over here.
Oh, I could see her
Alex.
dancing.
Yeah,
I wish the audience could see her dancing.
It's probably better that they can't.
Probably.
We need the ratings.
Right. All right. So Keith, I mean, you made a good point earlier that, I mean, people talk a lot about Gene's vision, and oftentimes they're
Right.
talking about the sort of egalitarian progressive versions of that. But you're right. The Gene's vision often involves a lot of weird sex stuff. I mean, if you read the motion picture novelization, or you read like the ideas he had that didn't make it to screen, like Troy's breasts and things like that,
Yeah.
Gene, he wasn't a prude. He was he was interested in that kind of like his idea of what a forward-thinking sexuality was. But I think a lot of times that sort of stuff dates itself quite quickly.
Yeah,
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
agreed.
And, you know, that immediately makes you think of the decontamination things in Enterprise.
Yeah.
And you immediately think there was no reason for that.
Right.
And that does date that show badly, I feel.
Yeah, and it's just a very inefficient way to decontaminate yourself, for one.
Well, there is that. You have a good point.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
All right, let me get. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go right ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to get this comment from Matt. He
Okay.
says, there is a sad reality that sometimes the best way to unify one group of people is to scare them with an outside threat, but this transfers prejudices onto others. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
See, Watchmen.
And then he
I was thinking
now
about
he
your
says,
name.
my gosh, he's chatty tonight. Nothing wrong with that, Matt. Keep going. He says, I do think that while progressive in his sex positivity is a good thing, it was from a bit of heteronormative perspective, you don't say,
Right.
which hasn't dated well.
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing they really haven't done much of on the newer shows, is you don't have like the sexy character, right? I mean, characters are sort of naturally sexy, but you don't have characters whose job on the show it is to be the sexy
Right.
character.
Which
Until, I
is
mean,
great.
we did have that Delton just recently, but
She
Yeah,
didn't
but she
last
got
long.
killed in 15 minutes. I
I
mean, there
know.
was oh,
She
that-
didn't count.
right.
Yeah.
but she was a
And
big
she-
part of the promotional material.
Right.
True.
Yeah. I think Matt made a very good point when he was talking about how it's almost the tyranny of the morality of the Federation, because one of the things about, you know, we talked about that the material has to evolve from when Gene did it in the 60s and I guess back in the 80s. Case in point, one of the things that comes up in any Star Trek conversation, this is real life. Could the Federation stand against the Romulan Empire and the Klingons if it doesn't have cloaking devices? And the answer is no. End of story. It just couldn't happen. Well, Gene Roddenberry said that the cloaking device was not honorable. He is the one that forbade them from ever putting the cloaking device into the Federation, and then they codified it. Gene said an honorable group of people like the Federation or Starfleet would not use a cloaking device, which is weird because he was an Air Force guy. And of course we would, but he said it was not honorable. So those weren't what he thought humans would become.
I'm sorry, he's wrong.
Right.
Because if the cloaking device were not honorable, Klingons wouldn't use it.
There you go.
Well, not only that, but the cloaking device literally hides you so you don't have to engage in conflict.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but Starfleet officers will beam down to planets in primary colors. Like there's not a whole lot of, they don't do camo real well.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's kind of example where he had this view of humans becoming better than what he thought we were. That actually kind of makes no sense. And of course, they go all the way around it. You know, you have it's the Treaty of Algernon, and you've got the episode. It's at the Pegasus, where Riker's first captain was working on a ship that could not only cloak but could phase through matter. And what I found so interesting about that episode is the actual outrage that Picard has. I mean, he's morally outraged. How dare you do this? You're violating treaty. It's like, dude, you guys have a ship that can cloak and go through solid matter. What you should really be saying is, okay, how can we use this thing? But because they're trying to adhere to that part of Gene's vision, Picard is morally outraged that Pressman developed a ship that can cloak and go through matter, which actually is a cool thing to do. That was always a weird episode to me for that reason.
You know, that makes me think. I hadn't thought about that episode in a long time. And there's a thing called situational ethics that really applies to the episode. And I wish I had thought about that when I was writing my chapter for the book on religion in Star Trek, because I have a lot to say about that. But anyway,
Yeah, I think
it's
that
not there, but that's okay. Because if I'd put everything in that chapter that I'd want to put, it would have been too much.
Right. It would have been one of Veronica's chapters.
One of Veronica's 3.
Yeah. No, I think that the idea of humanity holding ourselves to a higher standard works when we're making the effort to hold ourselves to a higher standard, not just that everyone is better. And I think that you have to sort of challenge that in the show, and they do that a couple of ways. Sometimes there's just people who want to do something terrible, like, hey, Picard, you have to relocate this group of people from their home, and that sort of thing. But I think when you have situations where it's like when Sisko and Calvin Hudson, where they're both sort of holding themselves to that standard, and they just disagreed about what that was. That Cal felt like joining the Maquis was the moral thing to do, and Sisko felt like standing with the Federation is the moral thing to do. And then you have those two forces meeting. And I think that works better than the one guy's evil and wants to steal youth from a planet, as opposed to, we just have really moral, high-minded people who now are in conflict with each other. We saw that again on Discovery when they had the big conflict about, should they destroy the dark matter anomaly, or should they make first contact? And there was good cases made on both sides, and you had Burnham and Book on opposite sides of the argument. I think that's where you get the good drama in Star Trek.
Right. And I think that's one of the things that was missing on Next Generation, in that you can have conflict.
Yeah.
Gene did not want conflict amongst the officers, but you can have conflict because everybody has, even when they're doing what they firmly believe is right, sometimes those ideas of what is right conflict with each other. And that's how you do it. That's how you live up to what Gene wanted, but also make it real and make it good drama.
Yeah.
And not make any of your characters bad characters. Nobody's in the wrong. They both, and it's just like in Scorpion, when Janeway and Chakotay have their falling out because they have diametrically opposed opinions of how they should address the situation. Neither of them is necessarily wrong. They both have very good arguments for what they want to do, but that's what brings them into conflict. And that's one of the things that I love about that episode so much.
Yeah, and that was a lot of the early Sisko Kira dynamic, was that they were coming from such different perspectives, and they were written from such clear perspectives that it makes sense that they're butting heads and they're opposed to one another because they have different goals, but they both feel like they're doing the right thing. But of course they sort of grew to being on the same page as the show progressed. But I mean, I love when Kira she doesn't just take it lying down that a Starfleet officer has come to her planet now, and sometimes she's wrong, but sometimes she very much feels that she's doing the right thing and she's looking out for her people. But I think that it just works really well on that show.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I think, Charles, you said something interesting too, and it goes back to what you said, how this is Gene's, and I think there's a slight delay between my video and audio, I've noticed, but I'm going to keep going, pressing ahead. You mentioned that, again, some of this is Gene's and what Alan said, there's Gene's almost personal and narrow visions, and then his general vision of us still being better people, because some of his narrow visions are weird to me. Like you mentioned, there's an episode of the TNG, and I forget the episode name, and I should remember. It's where the young man's mother, he's a young boy, like 14, his mother gets killed on the planet, he's already an orphan. And then this alien race that is basically disembodied, they feel so guilty that they recreate his mother. And he thinks his mother, remember the episode I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Well, when you see the episode after his mother's died, the boy is sitting in his quarters with his mom by himself. And he spends the entire show staying by himself. Troy shows up here and you okay, bye. Nobody hangs out with him. And I don't remember if Gene was alive or dead by then, but when I read the thing about that, they said, well, Gene had kind of said that by then humans would have evolved to the point where we would really understand death was just such a better, we would deal with death better. And so I think oddly, the man who in the 60s, and Alan, you make a very good point about Gene versus the network, the man who spent so much time in the 60s showing that those base emotions are who we are, the passion, the lust, the hatred, was kind of muting those passions in the TNG, because Gene just said, well, in the future, we'll just deal with death better. So basically the kid's mom's got dead, his dad's dead, he'll handle it. So there was no need to coddle the boy. And that's weird. That makes us feel almost a little robotic as humans in the future. But we also go back, Charles, what you talked about, and we've done recently. We saw his TV movies, Planet Earth and Genesis 2. They also have that 1960s, 70s humans in the future, just a little bit less emotional. Matter of fact,
Right.
they even tell the guy they woke up, look, you got to get rid of some of those emotions. They'll be the death of you.
We keep that
I-
mustache.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yes. And everybody in the future has peace medallions and wears some kind of silvery out thing. But that was also a thing in the 60s and 70s, not just Gene. There was a kind of an assumption that in 200 or 300 years at least, humans would be just a little less emotional than we are now.
Mhm.
And as Veronica said, we started, I don't buy it. One, I don't want it. And two, I don't, given where we are, we're not getting there in 200 years. So I think he might have been a little bit too optimistic, or I don't even know if it's optimistic. I think his vision's slightly different from mine for the future.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I do like the idea of a group of characters and a world where we think about things rationally,
Yeah.
and everyone doesn't just fly off the cuff, and people
Right.
sort of check themselves when they're wrong and have to confront
Mhm.
their own problem. That's one of the great things about Star Trek 6 was that, I mean, you have these great sci-fi television heroes who are now dealing with the fact that they're old men and they're obsolete, and they even talk about it that have we outgrown our usefulness? And they realize by the end that it's not just about only the old guys can save us. They get one last hurrah, but they make the decision that it's time for us to step aside. It's time to make way for the next generation. And oftentimes, and we get that a lot now, where you get old like 80s movie stars coming back, and they're coming
Yeah.
back as the hero. It's pretty rare, even in Star Trek. And Picard season 3 was all about how the old guys have to save the young folks. But it wasn't so much about them realizing that it's their own, like their generation's problems that they're carrying forward. You know what I mean? It's like their own prejudices are holding them back from progress. And I love that Star Trek 6 just dealt with that head on. And I know Gene didn't care for it, but really after the motion picture, Gene didn't really like any of the movies because they took him out of his hands. You know?
Right. And if you can't like the one with the whales, you're just not going to like any of them.
Right. She's got cetacean ops on her shirt.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
Talk about Gene's vision.
and that aligns perfectly.
Right.
Oh goodness.
Well, one of the things I find interesting too. We talked about this earlier, but one of the things we either when Gene was alive and he said it, or when we know later he wouldn't have liked it. What I find very interesting is, to me, some of the best episodes in all of Star Trek are the episodes that Gene actively, or in movies, are things that Gene actively hated and vocally said he didn't like, or that we absolutely know he wouldn't have liked. And so that kind of goes back to, I think you have to expand his vision, as Veronica said in the outset. We actually have to kind of sort of disagree with him, because there is just simply no doubt. Sisko's actions in the Pale Moonlight, there's no way Gene would have, ain't no way. He's like, no way. A captain doing what he did, there's just, and I don't know if Elaine and them have gotten to that, so slight spoilers if Elaine is listening.
Oh, they have not.
They're not
Okay.
in DS9 yet.
No.
Okay. So Elaine, spoilers here, real quick. I'm gonna say something in 5 seconds. Sisko doing what he did, which basically got some Romulans killed, and lying and doing what he did to bring somebody into war. That is one of those things. If you didn't think if Gene didn't like Star Trek 6, he would have hated that. But it's one of the best episodes in the Star Trek franchise. Why? Because it shows a human doing what humans do. And I love the end of that, because Sisko keeps telling us and himself, I can live with it. And he keeps saying it over and over.
Yeah, and
Trying to
the
convince
great
himself.
thing about that episode is that,
Mhm.
I mean, everyone talks about it as if Sisko did terrible things. He himself didn't, but what he did was cover up, make
Yes.
excuses for, allow, and you
Yeah.
know, like things that it'd be real easy to wash your hands of it, or for us to wash Sisko's hands of it and say, well, Garrick did all of those things. But
Yes.
Sisko is the one who's culpable, because
Right.
he was the one allowing it to happen. I think that's a good lesson
Exactly.
just for life, that you don't necessarily have to be the one doing bad things. If you're stepping aside, knowing that it's going to happen, then you are culpable.
I feel like it's
Yeah.
a better life lesson.
Mm-hmm. But also, you could also make a case, if he hadn't done those things, then the Federation would have lost the war,
Mhm.
and a lot more people would have died. And
Right.
you could say then that he is culpable for that. So either way, he takes the blame.
Mhm.
And sometimes you just have to do things on the risk that it's going to produce the best results.
Right.
And, you know, that's just human nature, having to make choices. And sometimes the choices, there is no good choice. Sometimes they both are awful.
Right.
But sometimes you just have to.
Yeah. And I really love in that episode, Bashir. The way, I mean,
Mhm.
and by this point, he's been working with Cisco for years. Like
Yeah.
they love and respect each other. But when it comes to the two, you know, to provide what is it, the I'm gonna say
Biomimetic gel.
yeah, the
Yeah.
biomimetic gel. And
Mhm.
I mean he really stands up and he's like, I would like that order in writing, sir, and I'm gonna
Yeah.
file this report. Like he gets right in Cisco's face. And I love that. This is his
Yes.
friend and colleague and coworker who he has a lot
Yeah.
of respect for, but he's gonna stand up and say, no, this is wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, and I never failed to think about the fact that Gene would have hated that episode, and if he had had veto power, it would have aired because that's not a Starfleet captain. And and I think about Gene's vision versus what happened later, because I wonder if Kirk had been faced with the ability to destroy an entire inimical race like the Borg with that strange mathematical pattern, if Kirk in that time would have taken it, because Picard in that time definitely didn't take that step because that was considered not what they were supposed to be at that time. And that's one of the things that's very different too, is by the time they get you remember the space whale or whatever it was, the creature where the little baby space whale attaches itself to the Enterprise in TNG and starts feeding off the engines. Well, they had to kill the mother because the mother was literally destroying the ship. She was about to destroy the ship. And it's bad. But Picard gets so upset, he gets up and he goes in his room and he looks like he's going to cry. I get it. But I always look at that and think, when Kirk would have done it, Kirk would have said something like, well, regrettable, because he blew up a space amoeba. Kirk would kill when he had to. But the time of Picard, especially early TNG when Roddenberry was there, Gene was so much more about, no, you just don't kill. Kirk killed and felt bad.
Kirk also had situations like A Private Little War where he had to make the decision to arm the other side.
Yeah.
And he acknowledged there. I mean, it was a very sort of similar ending to In the Pale Moonlight, where I mean, when he orders down, 100 serpents for the Garden of Eden, like knowing that no, he's taking part in dooming this planet, but he's doing what he feels he has to do to protect Tyree's people. But I think that they did give Kirk some sort of similar moral things to where he wasn't pure as the driven snow. He had to get his hands dirty as well. And then on the subject of the Borg, I mean, Kirk would have talked them into destroying themselves in part 1. There wouldn't even have been a part 2.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. I think that we make a lot of assumptions about what Gene would have liked or disliked. And, people say things like about, X. It doesn't matter what it is. They say, oh, Gene is rolling over in his grave. But you don't know that. I mean, you have to remember also that he was a soldier and he fought in the war. And it could be that he would totally understand Sisko in Pale Moonlight and the decisions that he had to make. And, his views evolved over his life. We have seen that. And we've talked about that earlier in our show tonight. But he would have continued to evolve his views and his vision the longer that he lived. So it is very possible that we might be wrong about what we assume he would have liked or disliked based on what we think about his vision. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a possibility. I always go about what he felt about the movies in some episodes of TNG.
Yeah.
It's very possible too.
Yeah, but ultimately he was a storyteller. And I mean, his stories didn't always align with the speeches that he would give about what humanity should be. But also, I mean, he was also very protective of something, the most successful thing he ever created. And he sort of wrestled with control over it his entire career. So yeah, there are certainly times when he would disown a movie. But oftentimes it was more to do with the politics involved behind the scenes. But I mean, obviously it would be difficult to create something that's as successful as Star Trek and not have a piece of it and not have control of it. And I mean, and then, you sort of have to go public, or not have to, but you do go public with your opinions of what they're doing with it, but also there was a certain amount of playing politics involved, because he would play the fan base, not play in a negative way, but he would use his influence over the fan base to try to influence Paramount as far as just getting more gigs and, and getting more producer credits and things like that.
Yeah. So a complex man,
Yeah.
Gene Roddenberry,
Absolutely.
definitely multi-layered. And I think that having that perceived standard is really what sets Star Trek apart from basically any other franchise. And I think it's the thing that really ties all these different shows together. You know, you can have something as different as DS9 and things that seem more aligned with each other, like Next Generation and Strange New Worlds. They all sort of like fit into this spectrum of continuity. I don't know how else to say it. And I think that having that end goal, what we think Gene's vision was, is what really sets that apart. I think that's what really makes Trek special.
Yeah. And I certainly would rather have like the current artists working on the shows writing their own interpretation of it, taking what it means to them and writing that, and not trying to play the guessing game of, you know, we all love Gene Roddenberry, but he's been dead for 31 years. What would he think about this, or what would he do, or what would he say? Because like you said, Alan, we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the continual interpretation is what keeps it fresh and alive. And makes the storytelling interesting.
Yeah, and relevant to what's going on now.
And relevant to what's going on, exactly. Because we live in a very different world than Gene did in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s.
Right.
Yeah, I think the way y'all both phrased that is absolutely perfect, because I agree. I think there are things that, you know, like I said, if I feel Gene would have hated it, but I think, as you say, even with Sisko, and again, not to spoil it for people like Elaine, but even with some folks like Sisko or Archer, when they go off the path for a while, they find their way back to what they're supposed to be. And I think that's the whole point. We got to be humans. We're going to make mistakes. I love in the original series, Wolf on the Fold? No, Day of the Dove. Day of the Dove. When the thing is getting them and Spock is getting ready to, like, I don't know, choke out Scotty or whatever. And Kirk grabs and says, stop it, you half human. And they're all like, holy crap, all that stuff that we feel, it just came out. And I love that because it's inside of them. But it should be there. You know, I spend so much time saying personal stuff on this show, but I remember talking to a lady years ago, who's married, she's a white lady married to a black guy. And we were talking one day, and she said something to me that she thought was like, I was going to agree with. She said, you know, she goes, you know, I just can't wait for the day when everybody's the same color. And there's no difference between anybody. And then racism will go away. And I'm like, no. First off, I don't want to look like everybody else. You should be proud of being white or an Asian or Mexican or black or blue eyes or green eyes. And then let's be honest, if everybody looks the same color, you'll go after overweight people, or you'll go after short people or tall people or thin people. You'll still go after people who are different religions, different sexualities, and so forth. So I'm like, no, you don't get rid of the problems by hiding the problems. You face the problems. And I think, as you said, that's what Gene was all about I think that we still do hold to the vision, other than with something like Section 31, because I rarely say it's not Star Trek, but the reason I think we all didn't like ultimately Section 31 is it wasn't saying anything in that world. It didn't give us the moral meaning and the message. It didn't tie effectively into it. And I would say that's not part of Gene's vision, simply because it was just science fiction. It was just there.
Yeah, well, I think it wasn't real Star Trek just because it wasn't good.
Yeah, this is true.
All right, let's get one last comment from Matt.
Hey, Matt.
He says, sometimes a child must outgrow the parents. That is the lesson I take with Trek. Raised well by Gene, but needed to grow beyond his vision.
Sure, yeah.
Oh, wait, there's more from Matt. Just came in, hot off the press. Conflict, at least nonviolent conflict, can help us achieve Gene's vision. There you go. Love it.
Matt, you want some t-shirt things tonight.
I'm telling you.
Regular Forrest Gump over here, handing out slogans.
Can we add a fifth section to our book and put all of Matt's comments in?
Yeah.
Oh, this has been a good topic, Keith. I'm glad you suggested this.
Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
This is good. So how about we got a couple of minutes? Let's talk about this.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because I feel like we need to remind folks that we are going to be at a little convention here in Atlanta called Stellar Fest, and that's is April 4 through 6. Chuck is running the Star Trek track, and I am running the Doctor Who track. And we have a lot of great stuff planned. And one of the great things that we have planned is the release party of this here book.
That's right.
Where you can come and hear us talk all about this book and then copy for yourself. And here's the cool thing. We're all going to be there. So if you get a copy of the book at the con, all 4 of the contributing authors, there's our names right there, are on hand to autograph it for you. But guess what else? This cover art, Mark Maddox, he's going to be there too. So you can even get the artist to sign the book. Oh, we have got you covered, top
That's
to
right.
bottom.
Yeah. That's going to be fun. We're shooting to do that Saturday at noon in the Star Trek track. But yeah, we've got a lot of fun stuff going on at the convention as well. It's not just a convention to get our book, but we're certainly happy for everyone to do so.
And
yeah.
speaking of shooting for,
Uh-huh.
Oh, yes.
I
Here we go.
am in the process of recruiting for a Star Trek fan film
Mhm.
that we'll be filming at the convention.
That's right.
Wow.
And we are needing people to be in the fan film. So if you are interested, please contact me on Facebook, Veronica Dashel.
Yeah, and there's 2 ways to get involved. We're going to have some cast members who have more lines and things, and there's also going to be an activity where you can just kind of sign up and come be a bystander in a scene, and we're going to be shooting it in the track room for a couple of hours with a crowd of people. It's going to be fun. But with my friend Randy Landers, who runs Potemkin Pictures, and he has shot over 120 fan films over the past decade or so. He's been on our show before. He knows what he's doing. And we've got a script by award-winning writer Bobby Nash. It's going to be a fun little film project.
Wow.
Wait,
So.
the thing that you're shooting, Veronica, is a Bobby Nash script?
Mhm.
Yes.
How
Yep.
cool.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
Yep.
Wow.
It's gonna be fun.
neato.
Yeah.
Yep. So reach out.
Yes. We're also
Right
doing a Gold Key Comics dramatic reading.
Mm-hmm.
And we need some dramatic readers who also may be willing to hopefully be in costume if they are willing, but primarily dramatic reading along with the panels from the awesome comics. So if you're interested in that, contact me too.
Cool. Very nice.
I
I've
will
got stuff
say-
going on in the Doctor Who track too. It's not all Star Trek.
It should be.
I will say back to the book, that cover. You look at that cover and it says Star Trek. I mean, it's
Right.
that could have been on the cover of an Alan Dean Foster novel or a novelization of the Star Trek shows. And that just, you look at it, that's Star Trek. That's a great cover.
Yeah, it's got kind of that James Blish Star Trek book feel to it.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it's a shame they don't make mass media paperbacks anymore.
Right.
Right.
All right. Well, Keith, where can people find more of you?
You can find me on Facebook, primarily the ESO Network Facebook groups. And I'm actually going to try to do a Blue Sky this weekend. I'll just have to find an alternative to Keith Johnson because I'm sure it's taken.
And how about you, Alan?
CosmicCreative.com. KOZMIC Creative.com. There you can find more information about this book. You can find more information about the documentary that I'm working on. And you should come to Stellar Fest because we are going to be, fingers crossed, we're going to be debuting the full trailer for that documentary at the convention. So come look for that. And that will not happen Saturday at noon because that's when we're doing our book release party. It'll be later on Saturday afternoon, probably like 2 or 3 or something like that.
And
So yeah, do that.
And how about us, Veronica?
Feltnerdy.com.
And
Monkeying Around, podcast about the monkeys.
that's right. And you have a closing for us this week?
I always forget every single week. We've been doing this for like 3 years.
4, I think.
4 years.
I don't know how many years. Live long and prosper.
Oh my gosh.
I know I used it last week.
I know. All
It's
right.
my default.
Thank you for joining us, everybody. Join us
Thanks, Paul.
Thursdays. We go live on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern on Thursdays, or you can listen to us after the fact on your favorite podcast platform, or find us on our YouTube channel. And we'll be here next week.
All right.
Take care.
See y'all next week.
Bye.